I'm Vance Pitman, the senior pastor here at Hope Church in Las Vegas, and it's an incredible joy and honor to be able to join with you church planters today via this webinar. It's an awesome opportunity for me every time I get the privilege to sit down with church planters because honestly, you're my heroes. I'm a church planter at heart. It's who I am. It's what God's called me to be, and I love the opportunity to invest in the lives of church planters and to just spend time with them. So thanks for taking the time to watch this today. This afternoon, we're really talking about the issue of faith and prayer as it relates to church planting. And there probably are not two words that are more linked to the issue of church planting than faith and prayer. I know for me, when God called me to church planting, it was overwhelming at first. When I thought about the responsibility and the opportunity to be involved in something like planting a new church, because to be honest with you, I didn't have a clue how to start. When we put our team together, we looked at each other and said, you know, God couldn't have picked three guys that knew less than we did about how to start a new church, particularly a church in a pioneer area like where we're located here in Las Vegas. I'm originally from Alabama. And being from Alabama, growing up there, people don't talk about Las Vegas, and they definitely don't visit Las Vegas, and if they do, they don't tell anybody. It's just that kind of a city. So you couldn't have picked anybody that knew less than I did about coming to a place like Las Vegas and planting a new church. So the desperation factor for me was incredibly high, and it was probably one of the greatest challenges for me as a church planter, just the overwhelming sense of what God had invited us to do, and my total lack of adequacy to accomplish what was before me. So that sense of overwhelming call produced a sense of desperation. And so what was a real challenge became a real strength in planting a church, because you need to be desperate for God. And that's exactly where we were. We knew if God's not God, we're sunk. And the whole issue of prayer and faith really hit us right in the face right when I got to Las Vegas. When I moved here in December of 2000, and in about the first or second week of 2001, in January, I was sitting in my living room. I didn't know anybody in Las Vegas. We just moved here, didn't know a soul, didn't have any relationships really in the town, and my telephone rings, and I pick it up, and on the other end of the line, there's a young lady from the Philippines named Letty Peralta. And Letty has since become legendary in our fellowship here at Hope. But Letty said, she spoke a little bit of a broken English. She said, "Pastor, can I tell you a story?" And I said, "Well, Letty, I don't know anybody in Las Vegas. You can tell me any story you want to tell me." And Letty said, "Pastor, I'm from the Philippines." She said, "I moved to Hong Kong to make money for my family that was very poor there in the Philippines." And she said, while living there in Hong Kong, I met an American family, and I moved in with them and became the live-in caretaker of their home, kind of a housekeeper and a keeper of their kids. And from that point, the family that she lived with really took her in. And then that family relocated from Hong Kong all the way to the United States of America to a suburb north of Atlanta, Georgia called Woodstock, Georgia. And they invited Letty to move with them. So they went through the process of filing for that paperwork in America, and she moved with this family from Hong Kong to Woodstock, Georgia, of all places. And while living in Woodstock, Georgia, Letty told me this. She said, "I visited a church called the First Baptist Church of Woodstock, Georgia, and I heard a pastor named Johnny Hunt preach the gospel." And she said, "God radically changed my life." But she said, "I only got to go to that church about 6 or 7 times before my family relocated again from Woodstock, Georgia, all the way to Las Vegas, Nevada." And she said, "Vance, I've lived in Las Vegas now for a year and a half, and I've prayed every day that the First Baptist Church of Woodstock, Georgia would start a church in Las Vegas, Nevada." And she said, "Pastor Vance, could you please tell me what church sent you to Las Vegas, Nevada?" Now at this point, I'm sitting there on the phone and my jaw is literally hanging wide open, because it was that very church, the First Baptist Church of Woodstock, Georgia, that had sent my family over 2,000 miles to the other side of the country to join in God's activity of launching a new church. And we had no idea Letty even existed. Nobody at First Woodstock even knew her or had ever even met her. She was just here praying. And so the story of our church here in Las Vegas, people ask all the time, because we're now 11 years old and have been involved in planting 16 new churches, and we're working on 4 continents around the world, training hundreds on an annual basis of international leaders and national leaders in countries. People call and say, man, what did you guys do? How did it happen? And to be totally honest with you, the story of our fellowship from its very beginning is really the answered prayer of one little Filipino lady who just loved Jesus and by faith trusted Jesus to do incredible things above and beyond anything she could imagine. And so right from the very beginning, that shaped us as a young fellowship. We were just a handful of people meeting in my living room. On the first night we gathered in February, we had 18 adults in my living room. But the story of Letty and her testimony and her prayer and her faith really shaped us as a fellowship. And it kind of developed a rally cry in our church where we said, we don't pray before we work. Prayer is the work, then God works. And everything about our fellowship began to be driven and motivated by this idea that we didn't come to start anything. We were simply joining in what God was already doing. And our response was simply to respond in faith, trusting that God would do everything that He said He was going to do, that God would be faithful to finish what He began if we simply stayed out of the way and stayed completely dependent upon Him. So from that moment on, we simply rode a wave of the favor of God in response to the prayers of His people. And it really affected our strategy early on as a fellowship. When we started to develop our strategy for how to plant, this idea of prayer and faith just really shaped it. And our strategy was somewhat agricultural. We basically took the first 5 months of being here in Las Vegas, and our strategy was to cultivate the field with prayer. To do like a farmer would do in a field, to go out and tear up the fallow ground and break up the soil to prepare it for the planting of the seed. And we knew that in a city like Las Vegas, it demanded that we engage the spiritual culture and climate that was here and break up the hard spiritual ground and just begin to cultivate that field. And we knew the only way to do that was through prayer. So strategically what we did was we took first of all, the Las Vegas phone book. Now I know that sounds kind of funny now because nobody even uses a phone book anymore. But back in the day, 12 years ago when we started, people still used the phone book. And all the names of the people that had phone numbers here in Las Vegas were listed in the book. And so we took the Las Vegas phone book. We distributed it to 3 different churches. And we prayed over every name in the Las Vegas phone book. If your name was in the Las Vegas phone book in the year 2001, we prayed by name 3 times over every person, 2 specific things. God, open their hearts to the gospel, and Lord, raise up laborers for the harvest. The second thing that we prayed, or the way that we prayed, was we brought out mission teams, and we took the 5 zip codes that surrounded our target area, roughly about 50,000 households in those 5 zip codes. And with those 5 mission teams in our core group, we prayer walked 50,000 households on the south end of Las Vegas. We walked up and down every street, and we prayed specifically over every home, those same 2 things. God, would you open their hearts to the gospel? And Lord, would you raise up laborers for the harvest? Knowing that what God was going to do in our city required others to join in our fellowship so that we could disciple and send out laborers into the mission field. So for 5 months, all we did as a fellowship was pray. We met in my home on Sunday nights. We'd do a Bible study together, and we'd prayer walk. We didn't hand out any invite cards. We didn't send out any mailers. We didn't do any of that. We just simply, February of 2001, started a Bible study in my home, 18 adults. Our team made up a lot of that. We had 3 families that moved here together. So the 18 adults, we were 6 of them. We had 12 adults that we'd engaged in Las Vegas. And that 18 started in February. And then over 5 months, we prayer walked those 50,000 households. But let me tell you what happened. Between February and early June, we saw that little core group of 18 grow to 70 people meeting in my home. Again, not passing out invite cards, not doing mailers. But God just literally began to, we would have people come and knock on the door and they would literally say, "We hear there's a church meeting here, can we come in?" And the stories of how God connected those people, the stories of how God brought those people, some of them believers, some of them unbelievers, to establish that core is just amazing. I don't have time to tell you all the stories of how God began to connect people in that fellowship. But early on in our home, we saw a multicultural, multi-generational fellowship. People from multiple nations, multiple ethnicities, and all the generational spectrums began to gather to the point where we would have to move all of our furniture out of our home and literally put seating just to get the 70 people crammed into our home. I mean, they literally didn't fit. Our home's not that big a place. And so, but all of that born out of this idea of just trusting God to do what He said He would do. And again, believing prayer is not what we do as Christians simply at the beginning before we work. Prayer is the work. Everything God desires to do in His sovereignty, He's chosen to do it in response to the prayers of His people. And I'll be honest with you, I don't understand everything about what I just said. I believe in a sovereign God who is sitting on the throne of the universe, and His plans are established in eternity past. But I also believe that the Bible says that God, within the scope of His sovereignty, has chosen to work in response to the prayers of His people. And that just became the passion of our fellowship early on. As we prayed, as we trusted God, and what it did to grow the faith of our people as we would pray. And I'll give you an example of one of the stories early on. We were meeting in my home, like I said, and we just could not get another person in our home. We literally, the last night, had people sitting on the kitchen counter. It was that packed in our living room. And I can remember standing up in front of our group that night and wanting to be the leader, wanting to be the guy that said, "Here's where we're going, here's what we're going to do, here's what God's shown us." And yet so frustrated because I didn't know what the next step was. God hadn't made it clear. I just knew we were where we were supposed to be that night. And I said to our team, 70 of us in the living room, "Hey, we need a place to meet next week. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what God's going to do. I don't know how God's going to provide, but I want us to pray." And so, man, as a group there, we just started praying in our living room, opened it up for people to pray. And I remember one elderly gentleman. He was about 70 years old, and his name was Lowell. And Lowell began to pray, and here's what Lowell said. He said, "Lord, You've called this group of people together. God, You've assembled this group in this home." And Lowell was a guy from Northern California. He was a retired oil executive, and Lowell was kind of rough and brash around the edges. And Lowell just said this in his prayer. He said, "Lord, You brought this young man out here from Alabama, and I didn't believe this was going to happen. And Lord, I'm watching it happen right in front of my eyes. But Lord, now we need a place." And here's what Lowell said: "Lord, we're coming after You." And as Lowell prayed that prayer, it was like in me, I just sensed this, yes, God is going to do something in response to the prayer and faith of His people. The next week, I was on a t-ball field coaching my son in Little League. And I looked up across the field and I saw a guy that I knew I recognized. His name was Randall Cunningham, the former NFL MVP quarterback for the Eagles and the Vikings and the Ravens and the Cowboys, and heyday with the Eagles. And I knew when I saw Randall who he was, and I knew his testimony for the gospel and for Christ. So I just went up to him and said, "Hey man, I just want you to know I appreciate your stand in the public sector for Christ and all that God's used you to do." And Randall asked me the same two questions everybody did when they heard my accent in Las Vegas. They said, "Where are you from?" And I told him I was from Alabama, and he said, "What are you doing here?" I told him we'd moved here to start a church. And I told him what we were going through, and Randall said, "Hey, I got a studio downtown. I'd love to invite you guys to come as long as you need to and use our studio." So boom, one week we prayed. The next week, God opens the door. That next weekend, we moved in Randall's facility, started meeting there. And that just was a continued pattern of God moving in response to the prayers of His people. So God provides. God always meets the need. God always leads and guides and takes care of all the details. I love what Paul wrote when he said, "Faithful is He who calls you, and He will also bring it to pass." Here's what that means. God didn't just call you to church planting. God's already taken care of all the details. Your responsibility is not to figure it out, dream it up, or plan it. Your responsibility is to trust Him. It's to trust Him, to walk in complete dependence on Him. So, as I bring this little section to a close, let me just remind you that church planting is a journey of prayer and faith. which means ultimately it's a journey of dependence on God. That's really what faith is. Faith is our dependence, our radical dependence on God. But don't forget what Paul wrote in the book of Romans. He said, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. You know what that means? Until you hear God speak, it's not faith. Too many times I hear church planters and those involved in mission activities say, well, I'm not real sure what God's leading me to do, so I'm just going to step out in faith. Listen to me. Let me protect you. That is not faith. That's presumption on God, and that's a very dangerous way to live your life, to lead your family, and to plant your church. Faith demands intimacy with God. You cannot live by faith if you are not walking in intimate fellowship with God to hear Him speak clearly into your life. And until He speaks, you wait to hear God speak. So the greatest thing you can do to lead your church plant by faith, through prayer, to trust God with great risk for all that He has in store, the greatest thing you can do is day by day walk intimately with God. Church planter, everything God desires to do through your life, He'll do out of the overflow of what He's doing in your life. Don't ever forget, God's primary call on your life is not ministry. It's not church planting. God's primary call on your life is intimacy. And out of the overflow of an intimate fellowship with Him, as you walk by faith, God will do through you what you never dreamed possible. So, enjoy the journey of walking with Him by faith.